In this documentary, I'm going to show you how Morse code became a weapon of war, how the very first interception battles began on American soil, why basic ciphers exploded from novelty to necessity almost overnight, and how U.S. intelligence started forming around one brutal, undeniable truth. If someone can send a message, someone else can steal it. But here's what makes this story bigger than history. By the end, I'm going to give you the exact three-rule framework that still explains every surveillance system, every encryption war, and every intelligence operation happening right now. Speed, interception, secrecy. These three words built the modern intelligence state, and they started on a wire. Here's your challenge. Every time you hear one of those three words, speed, interception, secrecy, keep score. Then ask yourself this question and be honest. If you were in command during a war, which one would you sacrifice first to win? Would you give up speed to stay secret? Would you risk interception to move fast? Or would you expose your position just to know what the enemy knows? Because commanders in the 1860s had to make that choice every single day. And the ones who got it wrong, their names are forgotten. The ones who got it right changed how power works forever. Before the telegraph, intelligence moved like a human body, on horseback, in coat pockets, in whispered conversations that died the moment the messenger died. Spies existed, plenty of them. Informants, scouts, sympathizers, double agents, the whole dark catalog. But the problem was never the lack of spies. The problem was time. Because by the time the truth arrived at headquarters, the battlefield had already shifted. The enemy had moved. The opportunity had closed. The war had turned while your message was still bumping along a dirt road at 8 miles per hour. Think about what that meant strategically. If you're a general in 1860 and you get word that the enemy is massing troops 200 miles away, that information is already 3 days old by the time it reaches you. Maybe 4. Maybe a week if the weather turns bad or the courier gets intercepted. So you're not making decisions based on reality. You're making decisions based on memory, on a snapshot of a war that no longer exists. You're commanding ghosts. And it wasn't just generals. It was presidents, governors, diplomats, merchants, anyone trying to coordinate action across distance. The entire architecture of power was limited by the speed of a horse. If your message arrives tomorrow, your enemy moved today. That's not a metaphor, that's physics. That's the constraint that shaped every empire, every military, every state structure for thousands of years. Information could not travel faster than a living body could carry it. Now here's the hinge. When information travels slowly, power travels slowly. Centralized control becomes almost impossible beyond a certain distance. You have to delegate. You have to trust. You have to accept that the person on the ground will make the call because by the time you hear about it, it'll be too late to intervene. Slow communication creates autonomy by default. But then electricity changed the rules. The telegraph didn't arrive as a military tool. It arrived as a commercial miracle. Businessmen used it to coordinate shipments. Newspapers used it to break stories faster than their competitors. Families used it to send word across state lines in minutes instead of weeks. The first message Samuel Morse sent in 1844 was religious, poetic. What hath God wrought? But the second wave of messages? Those were prices, deals, contracts, coordination. The telegraph became infrastructure almost immediately, an invisible grid connecting cities, markets, and eventually governments. And then someone realized, if you can send a business order in 5 minutes, you can send a military order in 5 minutes. If you can coordinate a trade, you can coordinate a battle. If you can move information instantly, you can move armies instantly. Or at least, you can move the decision instantly, and the army follow. This changed the psychology of command. Before the wire, a general had to think in terms of days, plan for days, except that once an order left his hand, it was beyond his control. But with the telegraph, a general could issue an order in the morning and have confirmation by lunch. He could adjust tactics in real time. He could respond to changing conditions not tomorrow, not next week, but now. Command stopped being local and became remote. A general with a wire becomes a different kind of general. He stops being a field leader and starts being a controller. Now imagine you're building this network during a civil war. You're stringing telegraph lines through contested territory, through states that don't agree on which government they obey, through forests where deserters hide, through towns where half the population wants you dead. Every mile of wire you install is a mile of vulnerability. Because the wire doesn't care who taps into it, it just transmits. The wire didn't report the war, it started steering it. And then the listening began. Picture it. A telegraph wire running through open country. No firewall, no encryption, no password protection. Just a copper wire wrapped in insulation, strung between wooden poles every 100 feet, stretching across fields and forests where anyone could walk up and touch it. If you can touch the line, you can listen. And if you can listen, you can read every message passing through. This wasn't theoretical, this was happening. Confederate scouts would climb poles in the dead of night, attach a small portable telegraph device to the wire, just a tap, a connection, and sit there in the dark, transcribing every Union message that clicked through. They didn't need to cut the wire. They didn't need to disable anything. They just needed to listen. And because Morse code is a binary system, dots and dashes, on and off, sound and silence, any operator who knew the code could read it. There was no authentication, no verification. If the message said, "Move the 3rd Corps to Fredericksburg," you had no way of knowing if that order came from your commander or from an enemy who just stole your communication and is now feeding you lies. Here's where it gets dangerous. Once interception becomes possible, it becomes inevitable. Because the moment one side realizes they can listen, they start listening all the time. And the moment the other side realizes they're being listened to, they have 3 choices. 1. Stop using the telegraph, which means giving up speed. 2. Keep using it and accept the risk, which means giving up secrecy. Or 3. Start disguising the messages, which means inventing encryption on the fly in the middle of a war. Guess which one they chose? Cipher systems exploded almost overnight. Not complex ones, there wasn't time for that, but simple substitution codes, root transposition, keyword ciphers, anything that could turn "attack at dawn" into something an interceptor couldn't immediately read. Some commanders used codebooks, pre-agreed lists where Apple meant advance and river meant retreat. Others used personal ciphers that only they and their recipient knew. The methods were crude, often breakable, but they worked just well enough to buy time. And time, remember, is the first rule. Every dot and dash carried a secret and a risk. Because even if your cipher held, the enemy still knew you were communicating. They knew the volume of your traffic. They knew when you went silent. Intelligence analysts started tracking patterns. If a particular station suddenly went quiet, maybe that unit was moving. If message frequency spiked, maybe an operation was being planned. You didn't need to break the code to learn something useful. You just needed to watch the behavior of the wire itself. This is the birth of signals intelligence. Not in World War I with radios, not in World War II with Enigma. Right here, in the 1860s, on telegraph wires strung through American forests, operators became intelligence assets. These weren't generals or spies in the traditional sense. They were technicians, mostly young men who knew Morse code and could tap out messages fast. But they sat at the center of the information war. They heard everything. They knew which generals were panicking, which supply lines were failing, which armies were about to move. Some stayed loyal, some didn't. Some took bribes. Some just talked too much in the wrong bar. Security wasn't a policy yet. It was a panic. And here's the question. If you were running intelligence operations, how would you even begin to secure this? You can't encrypt every message. It's too slow. And most field operators don't know cryptography. You can't guard every mile of wire. There's too much of it, and you don't have enough soldiers. You can't stop using the telegraph. Your enemy is using it, and if you don't, You're fighting blind. So what do? You accept that the battlefield of signals is always contested. You assume the enemy is listening. You start treating communication itself as a combat zone, not a support function. If this is the first time you're seeing the infrastructure of intelligence laid bare, subscribe, because the real history is never the battles. It's the wires underneath them. The war ends. The telegraph doesn't. In fact, the methods don't just continue, they professionalize. What began as improvisation becomes doctrine. Because once a government discovers that information can be intercepted, it starts treating communication itself as strategic terrain. Permanently. After the Civil War, the U.S. government doesn't dismantle its telegraph intelligence apparatus. It absorbs it. The skills, the operators, the interception techniques, the cipher systems, all of it gets folded into peacetime structures. The Signal Corps, which handled military communications during the war, becomes a permanent institution. They're not just maintaining wires anymore. They're training the next generation of operators in cryptography, in secure transmission, in the art of reading enemy signals. This is where modern intelligence gets its posture. Proactive, not reactive. Before the telegraph, intelligence was about collecting secrets after the fact, interrogating prisoners, intercepting letters, bribing informants. After the telegraph, intelligence becomes about controlling the flow of information in real time. It's not just what did they do, it's what are they about to do. And the logic spreads. Railroads adopt encrypted telegraphs to prevent sabotage. Banks start coding financial transfers to avoid fraud. Law enforcement begins using wiretaps, legally ambiguous but effective, to track criminal networks. By the 1870s, the idea that communication can and should be intercepted is no longer a wartime exception. It's a peacetime assumption. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The ability to listen never fully goes away once it's been learned. Governments don't forget how to wiretap just because the emergency ends. The infrastructure remains. The expertise remains. The legal justifications shift, but the capability endures. The war didn't invent secrecy, but it industrialized it. Encryption stops being the domain of diplomats and spies and becomes a basic feature of any system that moves sensitive information. Codebooks get published. Standards emerge. By the time the telephone arrives in the 1880s, the expectation is already there. If it's important, it should be secured. If it's transmitted, it can be intercepted. Now think about what that means for power. A state that can listen to its own communication networks can also listen to everyone else's. A government that can intercept enemy messages in wartime can intercept civilian messages in peacetime. The line between national security and surveillance starts blurring, not because anyone necessarily intended it to, but because the technical capability makes it almost inevitable. Methods outlive wars. Techniques developed to win battles get repurposed for peacekeeping, law enforcement, political control. The same intercept skills used to catch Confederate spies get used to catch counterfeiters, smugglers, anarchists, labor organizers, whoever the state decides is a threat. This isn't a conspiracy, it's just how tools work. Once you have a hammer, everything starts looking like a nail. And the telegraph companies themselves become complicit, willingly or not. Because governments can't intercept wires without cooperation from the people who own the wires. So they cut deals, they pass laws, they create legal frameworks that allow access. By the early 1900s, the idea that the government can tap communication lines with a warrant, or sometimes without one, is accepted practice in most Western nations. Here's the hinge. Once you build a system that can spy on enemies, you've also built a system that can spy on anyone. The infrastructure doesn't distinguish. The techniques don't care about intent. A wiretap is a wiretap. A cipher break is a cipher break. The question is never, can we? The question becomes, should we? And that question gets answered by politics, not technology. The logic only gets sharper in the next century. When radio arrives, the same playbook applies. Intercept, decrypt, analyze. When the internet arrives, same thing. The tools change, the paradigm doesn't. But let's zoom out for a second, because this isn't just about technology. It's about a shift in how states think about information. Before the telegraph, information was scarce, slow, and hard to control. After the telegraph, information is abundant, fast, and incredibly vulnerable. That vulnerability forces a new kind of statecraft, one where controlling communication becomes as important as controlling territory. Think about it. You can lose a battle and still win a war, but if you lose control of your own communications, you've lost before you start. That's the lesson that gets encoded into every military academy, every intelligence service, every government that survives the 19th century. Speed, interception, secrecy, these aren't just tactics. They're the foundation of modern power. Today, we think intelligence is satellites and server farms, encryption algorithms that would take 1 billion years to crack, signals bouncing through fiber optic cables at the speed of light, wrapped in layers of security so complex that even describing them requires a PhD. And yes, that's true. That's the modern surface. But the core logic is older than that. Way older. It's the same logic that played out on telegraph wires in the 1860s, the same logic that drove cipher development during World War I, the same logic that built the NSA, the same logic behind every encryption debate happening right now. Speed, interception, secrecy. The tools change. The fight doesn't. Let's trace the line. Telegraph wires become telephone lines. Telephone lines become radio waves. Radio waves become microwave relays. Microwave relays become satellite links. Satellite links become internet packets. At every single stage, the same three-part conflict repeats. Someone builds a faster way to communicate. Someone else figures out how to intercept it, and everyone scrambles to secure it before the advantage disappears. World War I. Radio interception becomes industrial scale. Entire listening posts are built just to eavesdrop on enemy wireless transmissions. Room 40 in Britain, the Cipher Bureau in France, the MI8 Black Chamber in the US. These aren't small operations. They're full bureaucracies dedicated to signals intelligence, employing thousands of people whose entire job is to intercept and decrypt enemy communications. World War II. Enigma, purple, the entire Allied effort to break Axis codes. The same logic, bigger scale. The side that can read the enemy's mail wins. Bletchley Park doesn't just shorten the war, it establishes the template for Cold War intelligence. After 1945, signals intelligence becomes permanent, institutionalized, classified at the highest levels. Cold War. The NSA is founded in 1952, and its entire mission is SIGINT, signals intelligence. Intercept everything, decrypt what you can, analyze the rest. The Soviets build their own version. So does Britain, France, China, Israel. By the 1970s, every major power has a dedicated agency whose job is to listen to the world's communications and protect their own. And then the internet arrives, and the battlefield explodes in scale. Suddenly, it's not just governments and militaries communicating electronically, it's everyone. Billions of people sending trillions of messages, all of it bouncing through infrastructure that can be tapped, intercepted, recorded, analyzed. The same wiretapping logic from 1862 now applied to fiber optic cables carrying the entire global conversation. Snowden Revelations 2013. We learn that the NSA has been collecting metadata on virtually every phone call and email in the United States. The justification? National security. The method? Interception at the infrastructure level, tapping the actual cables and switches that carry internet traffic. It's not a new idea. It's the oldest idea, just scaled up. Here's what most people miss. This isn't a tech problem. It's a power problem. Because the side that controls the communication infrastructure controls the information flow. And the side that controls the information flow controls the narrative, the intelligence advantage, the ability to act while others are still figuring out what happened. The first wiretap war taught a brutal lesson. The side that controls communication controls reality. Not truth, reality. Because if you can intercept the enemy's orders before they're executed, you can position your forces to counter them. If you can read their strategy, you can outmaneuver them without ever confronting them head-on. If you can feed them false information through their own compromised communication channels, you can make them defeat themselves. And once you see that pattern, you start spotting it everywhere. Every time a government passes a law requiring tech companies to provide law enforcement access to encrypted data, that's the same fight. Every time a whistleblower reveals a surveillance program, that's the same fight. Every time you're told to use a VPN or enable two-factor authentication or avoid public Wi-Fi, that's the same fight. You're living in the aftermath of America's first wiretap war. The battlefield just moved from wooden poles to glass cables. The interceptors moved from Confederate scouts to server farms in Utah. But the rules? The rules are the same. Now, final challenge. Go back through what you just learned and ask yourself, where are these 3 rules playing out in your life right now? When you send an email, who else can read it? When your phone connects to a network, who's listening? When a company says your data is secure, what does that actually mean? Because the moment you start seeing the infrastructure, you stop being passive in the system. You start asking the right questions. You start understanding why encryption matters, why privacy isn't paranoia, why the fight over who controls communication is the same fight that's been happening since 1862. The tools changed, the logic stayed. And now you know the framework. If you want more hidden wars, the moments when technology quietly rewires power and nobody notices until it's too late, subscribe. Next time, we're following this same logic as the battlefield moves from wires to airwaves. And you'll see how radio interception during World War I created the intelligence agencies that still run the world today. But here's the real question I'll leave you with. If you had to build a communication system right now, knowing everything you know about speed, interception, and secrecy, which one would you prioritize? Because that choice determines what kind of world you're building. Fast and insecure? Slow and private? Transparent and vulnerable? Think about it. Because someone, somewhere, is making that choice for you right now.